I feel like I need to be surrounded by objects from my ancestors because they connect me to my history. And without them, I kind of feel historyless.
Hey everyone, my name is Sean. I'm the founder of Memoria Films. On this channel, we are all about connecting generations within the family. On today's podcast episode, I speak with Lauren Karle, a ceramic artist and college professor who recently finished an 11-week art workshop called Pottery for Generations that took intergenerational connection to a whole new level. I hope our conversation gives you some ideas for how you can increase connection in your family. You'll find links to Lauren's work in the description, as well as chapter markers throughout this whole video. And before you get too far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content that's geared towards creating connection in your family. I hope you enjoy the conversation. I have to just read Lauren's bio because she does so much work, a lot of it in the intergenerational space. So Lauren is a community engaged art educator who runs the Creative Exchange Studio. She also teaches at College of the Desert, and she is an active artist. She's a credentialed K-12 art educator and has a Master of Fine Arts in ceramics. And her goal is to have her work serve a purpose beyond its utilitarian function by designing it for who and how it will be used. I can't wait to talk about this. She loves family, clay, cooking, and tradition. And in her free time, she goes hiking with her 3-year-old son, almost 4 years old, because our sons are very close in age, husband and her dog. And she is so excited to help other people fall in love with creating and building community. Lauren, thank you so much for joining me today on this podcast. I'm so excited to chat with you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited for our conversation as well.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk about, some of the work that we've been able to do together. But I'm just going to tee up our conversation with probably the easiest question I'll ask you all day. Okay. And that is, if you had to tell your entire life story in under 10 minutes, how would you do that?
Well, I grew up in Wisconsin and I had kind of like a Candyland childhood, as in I had a good family, stable, kind, providing. The world was good, right? I went to college and I feel like I became solid in my identity there. But college was a big life moment. In college, I studied abroad, and that absolutely changed my perspective of the world. I feel like I traveled a lot. The world became smaller and bigger at the same time because I had this view of like, I'm going to travel the world. And I traveled all over Europe and I felt capable in that. But then at the same time, it opened my eyes to like, Europe is not the world. The other big thing I think in college that I took away from that experience was through my teaching methods class. I had a class that looked at each subject and what was the purpose? Why are students in that class for that reason? And the purpose of art class is visual communication. And so this is something I preach to my students. Art is powerful. And it's because you can communicate no matter where you go, what language people speak. If you show them a picture of, say, a tree, they're going to know that's a tree. You don't need to know that word in that language. And so it's really a universal language. Some people would argue numbers are as well. But I think art, whether it be music, you can feel the rhythm. People know the emotion coming from it. Visual art, photography, it documents, it communicates no matter, you don't have to know that person's language. To me, that's the power of art. And that's one of the things that I took away from that class, is feeling empowered to say something through my own art, and also really, really excited to help students find what do they want to say to the world, right? I posed the question, if you could stand at the top of a mountain and say one thing to the world, what would it be? And that's what you should be making your art about. So college really changed me. After college, I moved to Guatemala. I knew I wanted to live somewhere different and new. Part of why I love traveling, and not just traveling, but living in different places, is because I learned new ways of living. In the end, some things I was like, oh, the United States does this so much better. And then there were some things that I'm like, man, the culture in Guatemala does this so much better. And so by learning different ways of living, I feel like I don't just live by the default of how I've always done it, but you can choose, right, to the way you want to live. I would say the next kind of big moment in my life that was a growth experience was that I moved to Nebraska, where I was a postbac. purpose of being a postbac is to learn and grow and build your portfolio to apply to grad school, to become a practicing artist. And learning ceramics was very much like learning Spanish. And I didn't realize that my prior experience in Guatemala would impact me so much. I'm a linear thinker. I like to learn step one before step two. And learning a language, moving to Guatemala and not knowing Spanish was not a linear process. It was immersion. It was all at once. And same with ceramics. When I got to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, I was surrounded by an incredible wealth of knowledge. And it was not step one before step two. It was all at once. Grad school, I went to Kansas State University. And in grad school, I really had to ask myself, okay, if the purpose of art is visual communication, if there's one thing I could say to the world, what would that be? And I had to start making my work about that. And so my answer was, I want to encourage people to approach those who are different from them with curiosity rather than fear. I tried to make my work have more than just a utilitarian function. And the other function is to build community. And so I started doing socially engaged art. And when I take the ceramics from the kiln, I look at it as only half done. Using pottery is a time for community. It's a time for eating. It's a time for conversation. Food carries our culture with it. We build rituals and traditions around that. So that became the purpose of my work, right? I make these objects, but what can these objects then do as they go out in the world? And that very much has influenced pottery for generations. Then after grad school, I moved to New Mexico to be with my boyfriend, now husband. And living in New Mexico, we lived on a national wildlife refuge. It was in the middle of nowhere in rural New Mexico, about an hour and a half from Santa Fe. It changed me to the core. I've connected with people everywhere I've lived, and it was the first time I connected with the land. And I miss it. I deeply miss it. And it's still with me. I watched a bison harvest. So the bison that grazed that land belonged to the Pueblo of Pewaukee. Their herd grazed on federal land, and they would have to harvest them because the population would grow. They'd have babies every spring. And if you overstock the land, it's unhealthy for the land because they eat too much of the grass and it becomes a desert, right? And so they have to harvest every fall and winter. And I'm a city girl. I grew up in the city. And in watching this bison harvest, the animal was shot and we came around and it was still like kicking. And I was so upset. I'm like, it's suffering. Like, can't you kill it? Like, and one of the scientists with us said, some animals have a stronger desire to live. Dying is a process. Some animals fight harder than others to live. And it was just like this. It was hard to accept, but it's the reality. And I think that's true in humans too. Dying is a process. I also got married while I lived in New Mexico. My husband is from Mexico. He was not a citizen. He came here for grad school and has always been on like a 1-year visa for education, work. And it created a great amount of uncertainty for us. We did get him residency. The first green card he got was a conditional green card, and the condition was our marriage. And so we had to go into a immigration officer and talk with her about why we were married. And I know I married him for the right reasons. I truly loved him and wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. But how do you prove that to somebody else, right? So that was a bit scary. And, just like learning about myself in the process of joining lives with somebody else. And, part of why I'm sure I was attracted to him is that he has so much to teach me from, he's a scientist, I'm an artist, to his love for nature and his commitment. He is so committed to helping Mother Earth, right? And his ability to be resilient. He did not have the same just world that I did growing up. And he knows how to live with uncertainty a lot more than I do. I've learned so much from him, and I'm really grateful for that. Let's see, I moved to Minnesota. We really struggled to find jobs in the same area in New Mexico, and we didn't want to leave necessarily, but we wanted to have a life together. And so we moved to Minnesota, and I taught in a large, diverse public school for the first time. Also, while we were there, George Floyd was murdered in the Twin Cities where I was living, and it shook our entire community. I was teaching art in a high school, and a very diverse high school. equity became a regular topic of conversation in and outside of schools. And honestly, this kind of became my mission as a teacher, is to try to create equity amongst my students. So Minnesota, honestly, was hard. It changed me. I learned a lot. And then we landed in the Coachella Valley. So after a year and a half of being unemployed, my husband has a PhD in grassland ecology. And so after a year and a half, he was hired here at the Living Desert. And then right before moving from Minnesota, we were actually in the process of moving and my grandma died. I do feel lucky that I had 3 years in Minnesota living driving distance to her. And I often think about how she handled adversity. And that gives me strength. I think about her sense of humor. Oh my goodness, it carried her so far in life. From her marriage with my grandpa, that they lived for each other to the last day, right? She found joy in the daily interactions and the routine chores, just feeling her gratitude for all the good things that she had in life, her family. She had her priorities straight. So when I'm struggling, I definitely think about her and the lessons that she taught me, not articulating them, but just through example of how she lived. And I guess the last thing is, I was doing a Oprah and Deepak meditation, and it asked me, like, when am I the happiest? When am I the most fulfilled? And I realized it's when I'm with people from another culture, because I'm learning. I'm learning new ways of living. I don't live in Guatemala anymore, but I realized I can seek those people out here as well. I really, really deeply value when people share their culture, their traditions, their ways of life with me. It's an honor to learn from them. It's a gift. So I think that's where some of Pottery for Generations comes in.
Yeah. Oh man. Certainly on the cultural side, as much as Pottery for Generations, which we're going to get to in a minute, is about connecting generations within a family, it's clear now looking back how much of the cultural influence, and connecting cultures is actually a big part of Pottery for Generations. So, Lauren, can you just share with our viewers what Pottery for Generations was all about?
Yeah. So Pottery for Generations, people sign up in families, and they need at least 2 generations of a family to sign up together. The program is 11, 12 weeks long, and people come once a week for 3 hours. It was on a Tuesday night last year. During the first 5 classes, they learn basic clay skills, from hand building, like coil building, slab building, pinch pots, to then surface decorations such as sgraffito and slip transfer and inlay. So they learn how to decorate the surface of their ceramic work as well. The second half, then they would get a stipend, and they would identify a family recipe. And the older generation would teach the younger generation this family recipe. And I asked them to document it. So they would take pictures of each step of the cooking process. They would write down kind of the steps, because most family recipes are not written down. Yeah. And then they shared that recipe with me. And the next 5 sessions, they would design, build, and decorate. We glazed, fired again, their ceramic serving dish. In the end, they got another stipend, and they bought food and cooked again together on the day of our potluck. And they brought that food in Tupperware containers. And on the day of the potluck, they arrived and they got to see their finished serving dish for the first time. And then they put their food into that serving dish. We set them out on the tables. We all shared a little bit about our traditions and our stories and our history of why we chose that recipe, and then how the things around us that influenced the design of the dish. Yeah. And then we all feasted together. So we broke bread, shared life, and got to try each other's most meaningful family recipes.
Isn't that so cool?
Ultimately now I'm writing a cookbook, and it has a blurb about the family traditions and the dish design. And it includes the family recipe, but it's more, I would say, of an ethnographic documentary of the ephemeral art that happened in the interactions of the participants.
Oh man, so cool. Yeah. And I was fortunate enough to be part of the 3rd session to document, with video, a couple of those sessions. And I got to sit actually at the potluck and enjoy the meals with you guys. I was just blown away. I mean, I told you from the very get-go when I heard about Pottery for Generations, and the whole purpose of it, right, is to connect families through ceramics and then cooking, all, blended together. I mean, what an incredible idea and vision. I'm curious.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I hope, and we'll talk about, what's coming next for Pottery for Generations in a bit, but how did you decide that ceramics or pottery was the venue for you to make a difference in the world?
I mean, as a kid, I always loved making. I think every single human being, we're designed to be makers, and that can be in different media. It can be in different, my husband brews beer. That's his art, right?
Yeah.
Cooking is an art. We are born to create.
Mm-hmm.
And ceramics, clay was just the thing that I was drawn to. That was my medium. There was a point where I was questioning it, our ecosystem is falling apart, climate change, things like that. And I was like, what am I doing making art? Like, I should be, doing something with the world, climate change. And I went to this conference and they were like, your job is to do the thing that you are passionate about and gifted in. And I was like, I am doing the right thing. Like, this is how I am meant to bring people together. This is how I'm meant to, try to get people to create and find their passions too.
Obviously, the people who are going through this program, they're getting to cook together and make this piece of art, really, this ceramic art together. But what was kind of your vision for those pieces of pottery, like after the class was done?
Yeah, my hope is that they become family heirlooms. Hopefully they're passed down generation to generation. And it's not just the object, but hopefully the tradition and the pride in that tradition. The rituals around that object get passed down from generation to generation. Hopefully it's preserving culture and heritage, ultimately making people proud of their identity, of where they come from, of their background, and hopefully grounding them.
Obviously, these objects have particular meaning to the families because they're tied to, an experience that they did together in creating the piece. They're also tied to a family recipe. But what role do objects in general play in our connection with each other and in our cultures and just in life in general?
Yeah, we are surrounded by so much stuff more than ever. The objects we surround ourselves with should be meaningful. They should be either sentimental, they should add to our life aesthetically. I know for me, my husband, we've moved so much and we haul these meaningful things around. My grandpa was a woodworker and I can't let go of them because they connect me to my history. I have ceramic jars from my grandma. I have furniture from my grandpa. I have a silver-plated tea set. It's silver, so it needs polishing, which is really annoying. But it's plated, so it's not solid silver. So it's actually worth like $30 on eBay. But I look at the handle of this teapot, and I'm like, my grandma held this same handle. And she poured it to her family and to her friends from this teapot. And now my hand is holding that, right? And so I hope the objects that the participants create, I hope they can, see that this was created by the hands of their people, of their family. Something that a Mexican philosopher named Octavio Paz says, craftsmanship does not last forever, but it's not disposable. It follows the course of time from day to day, flowing along with us, gradually wearing out, neither pursuing death nor denying it, but rather accepting it. The craft object teaches us to die, and by doing so, teaches us to live. And I just feel like, the objects will chip, they'll get bumped around, they'll get banged, but they're not commercial objects that somebody's going to toss just because it has a chip in it, right? It's an object that hopefully that family will treasure until it literally dies and breaks in half and is no longer functional, right? For me, I feel like I need to be surrounded by objects from my ancestors because they connect me to my history. And without them, I kind of feel historyless.
That's a good point. It makes me wonder how many of the things in my house, if any, are really connected to, previous generations and in my family. Not just like pictures, because that's not what we're talking about. When you talk about objects, you're talking about physical pieces, and certainly whether they're, utilitarian in nature, like they're, be used for something, or, just some other type of object that has some history in it. Am I actively thinking through what objects I want my kids and grandkids to be interacting with at some point in the future? So that's super, super helpful.
And the physical touch of it, that their hands touched it. And with Pottery for Generations, their hands created it.
Yeah, I can only imagine 4 or 5 generations from now, some of those great grandkids going, oh yeah, this was, great great grandma and great grandma and grandma all three made this pot together. And this is the recipe that they also cooked specifically for this pot. Like, just incredible vision. So
yeah,
congrats on the success of the first 3 sessions of Pottery for Generations. I hope you get great news in the very near future about, a bigger grant that you can serve more people in our community with it. I think it's just an incredible mission. And certainly I know that it's bigger than just creating pottery for these families, because I think one of the things that I'm realizing is that the more families that do this tough work of creating connection, between the generations and their family, we know that produces better people. The individuals in that family are more grounded emotionally. They're more healthy in a lot of ways, right? More resilient, more confident. And if enough families do that, then all of a sudden now you've got an entire community or society that's changed from the inside out. So don't be fooled. Like, this work actually has a ripple effect that can impact entire communities of people. So it just was so cool to watch the connections between, there was only I think there were 6, maybe 7 families. Talk a little bit about some of the results you saw from your program. I know you're probably in the midst of kind of the data collection to put some numbers behind this, but just from an experiential standpoint, what did you see? How did the act of creating this piece of art bring these families together, and obviously the cooking as well? But yeah, just tell me about what you saw as sort of the facilitator of this program through the family connection.
Yeah, it definitely built community. I have one family in mind in particular that said, we have really busy lives between school and work. And, we are a close family, but we'd grown more distant. And by making the time every Tuesday to sit down and not just be next to each other doing their own thing, not just in the same proximity of the house, but invested in the same object, in the same learning experience, brought them much closer together. And they said their relationship grew because of it, just a mother and daughter. One family, their son had health issues. And she said, with all of her other children, she connected with them through sports and doing their activities and events. And because of his health issues, he couldn't do those things. And most of their connection time was spent in hospitals. And just how grateful she was to have an experience that was meaningful outside of, trying to create a good hospital stay.
She went through this program with her son with health issues. Wow.
Yep.
That's so cool.
Yep. And the grandmother did it with them too. One thing that I found interesting was, so her mom and dad both worked in kitchens as a career. And she was never really taught. They were a Hispanic family and never really taught Mexican recipes. She's like, I could make a really great lasagna or something like that. But their tradition was kind of, she was kind of shooed out of the kitchen because it was work, right? Like, they didn't have time to be slowed down as a kid because it was their job. And so she was, for the first time, cooking with her mom to learn their traditional recipes that belong more to their family rather than to the restaurant life, right? And they were going to try to continue to cook together and document them and kind of build their own recipe book outside of this class, which is a really cool that it has legs, right? That it's going to hopefully continue to bring them together. I have also had one family talked about how, since their family moved from Mexico, they were 3 generations. They moved here from Mexico and they couldn't always have access to their ingredients from Mexico. And also the grandma in her 80s has diabetes, and how they've kind of forged their own new traditions. They literally created the recipe that they gave me, that they cooked for our project. So it's pretty cool that sometimes they reach backward and dig up old traditions, or one family with borscht was reviving a family tradition, where some families are looking to the future and saying, okay, we want to make healthier choices. We want to kind of make our own way, right? So they're creating their own new culture that is a blend of where they've been and where they're going. Another thing that I really tried to do is to kind of create pride of their culture and their traditions. And I think that was successful. the honoring of our elders, right? To look at them as you have this wisdom, you have this experience, this knowledge that the younger generations don't have, and you have something valuable that you can pass down, right? That their lives can be better because of knowing that. One family, they had an idea, they sketched, and then the next class, they came, and the elder generation had used all things from her house, and she had made flour with water and newspaper and pinched. It was like a work of art in itself. Pinched her own little maquette of what she wanted to build up with clay, and the family honored her ideas, and they totally switched direction because she had spent time and thought in this new form that she'd built out of basically her homemade paper mache.
Yeah.
Wow. And then there was a family that honored the younger generation's ideas. It was really cool to watch. He had made sketches, and the grandma started building, and he goes, no, you're doing it all wrong. Right. And they stopped and like tried to re-understand his ideas, and they changed direction, and they honored the younger generation's ideas. And so it was a really, really beautiful to watch how all the generations were able to respect each other's ideas and experiences and, their process.
Yeah. What's striking me as I'm listening to you talk is just how I think we have to break out of this idea that, connecting generations within the family is all about like the transfer of information. It's just sharing your story, which I think obviously with the work that I do in creating video biographies, I think that's a big part of it. But what I love about what you're doing is you're creating connection through experience together. It's honoring the generation through like listening to their ideas right now in the present, which may have nothing to do with their history, right? There's no information in that. It's just you're creating connection in a totally unique way, and certainly with cooking too. I know I got to actually film one of the families, the one that you referenced, that had 3 generations present, and actually their daughters, the 4th generation, actually got in on the cooking as well when they cooked their final meal. And just to see them even honor the ways that they cooked, that they liked to cook, and the specific dishes that they like to use, or the way they chopped bell peppers. I mean, it's silly, but it was a really unique experience to just kind of watch that unfold and to see them respecting one another through that whole process. So what place do you think pottery and art, and certainly cooking, has in the realm of connecting generations within the family, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I see it directly connected to education. The knowing, okay, fine, I know a family recipe. The understanding, I understand where that person is coming from more in their life experiences. But then the doing, like, let's cook it together. Let's do it together. And so a lot of the connections are built through the doing. They're built through the design process. They're making decisions together. They're brainstorming together. They're coming up with ideas. They're problem solving along the way when their pot cracks. Or they come up with, one of them comes up with a different idea. How do we incorporate that? So they evolve and they adapt as they go. One family had a design with butterflies on top that represent their migration, and that we're all migrants because Native Americans were the original people on the land. They believe that water is life, and so they chose blue for their background. They had a sunflower on the front of it because their grandpa randomly planted sunflowers in their yard, and it was strange and odd, but they embraced it, right? And so it was kind of that symbol of him. And so, one of them even said in that our communication has slowly gotten better because of all the deep conversations they've had through their design process, through the doing, through the decision making, and ultimately the coming up with the finished product. So the doing is very important.
Yeah, it facilitates those conversations. So if you're a family and you're struggling to, it can be very awkward to just sort of start talking about your history if you haven't built habits like around your dinner table or, any other sort of habits where you're actively telling your story. I would just encourage you to do something active together, do a piece of art together, cook together, and see if that conversation doesn't just come about more naturally as you're connecting through experience. So, because I do think, again, that the transfer of information and sharing your story, there's a ton of research that I've been doing recently around how much more resilient and confident your kids can be when they know your story. And certainly when those storytelling practices are a habit in a family. It's such a cool thing to watch art be that sort of foundational act that opens the door for conversation, right?
As a teacher, I 100% agree that when kids know their history, when they have pride in their identity or identities, that they're more grounded. I see that in my classroom, and I want that for my own kid too.
Let's quickly talk about your work as a professor, because you're also an adjunct professor at College of the Desert here in Palm Desert, and where you teach ceramics, the very thing that you just did with Pottery for Generations. So what do you think the importance is for certainly young adults and even children to be doing work with their hands, to be producing something with their hands in a world that is primarily digital?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest things with clay is your hands are dirty, right? You can't be on your phone. And I always tell my students, life is so stressful and we're constantly multitasking. And when you walk in this classroom, your goal is to put everything outside the door to the best of our ability. And I try to do the same as the teacher. It doesn't always happen, but I try to focus and like mentally tell yourself the only thing you have to do right now is make art. And to gift yourself that time, right? That uninterrupted time where you're not multitasking. It is rare, especially with technology these days. So to be sitting at a wheel and have your hands with clay running through it, to feel the water, the smoothness, the grit in the clay, the grog, to feel those sensations and be present in the moment. That is unique.
Yeah.
It sounds bad, but in today's day and age, it is.
I don't know if you know this, Lauren, but before I launched Memoria Films, I was actually a teacher for a short stint in the high school, middle school, high school math teacher for Desert Christian Academy. A little shout out. I love them. Our kids still go to that school. But one thing that I saw, and this was years ago, like before COVID, I believe it's only gotten worse, is just this lack of grit and perseverance. Not every kid, but it's certainly trending in that direction where, kids are less willing to do hard things that take a long time. So I can attest just from watching through Pottery for Generations how ceramics provides the opportunity to do exactly that, to work at something for an extended period of time. And, actually you might work at something for an extended period of time and then it just cracks. And then like all the time feels wasted almost. Like, can you speak to just the importance for, this upcoming generation to work at things like this with their hands, and to, even if it's just to develop those, character traits of perseverance and grit and all that?
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Clay is the least instant gratification material you can have. First, you need to build and don't let it dry in the process, and it might crack, or, you have to start over multiple times. But then you have to let it dry slowly so it doesn't crack. Then you have to bisque fire it, which is always a risk. It shrinks more, right? Yep. If it makes it through that, then you put glaze on it. Then you have to fire it again. Maybe the gray glaze will dunt or, crack or like bubble. Something will happen. So it's always another risk. If you happen to get a finished piece, it's amazing. I used to have a professor that said, opening a kiln is like Christmas or Halloween. It's either like presents, like amazing, or horrifying, right? Yeah, because clay is a very difficult material. Oftentimes I don't have a grade in the grade book till halfway through the semester because it's that long of a process. Yep. I always stress to my students that it's about the experience rather than the product. And I tell them, I'm like, make some bad art. Don't be afraid, because that's how you learn. Failure is how we learn. And I try to really encourage them to come into the studio with the mindset of play and experimentation, because that's how I make my best work. If I go into my studio and I'm like, I've got this show and I have to make this masterpiece, or I have this sale and I got to produce, right? Like, I make bad work and it breaks or something goes wrong. If I go in there with the mindset of, I'm going to play, I'm going to see what happens. I'm going to experiment.
Mm-hmm.
I learn a lot more. I have much more fun, and it's ultimately much more successful. And so that's something that I really encourage my students to enter the classroom studio with the mindset.
Yeah. As I think about creating connection within the family, certainly I don't think every family is going to have access to clay or the knowledge, right? Like it's something that you do have to kind of like take some classes in or some training, whatever. But one thing that struck me when you were talking about, working with clay is that your hands are dirty. So you literally cannot reach for your phone. So that's something that instantly I can think, okay, what is something that I can do with my hands with my children that like restricts me from, reaching for my phone, which is always a temptation. So I absolutely would encourage families, get out the paint, finger paint if you have to, or go play in the mud. Kids love to do things that get them dirty. We know this. So let's do the things together so that we can, put our phones aside, create connections. Hopefully in the process of those experiences, we're also talking with our children. We're telling them our story, or we're getting them to ask questions. Let them, provide them opportunities to ask you questions so that you can share your story. If anything, I hope our viewers take away, it's really important to do activities together as the sort of seedbed for conversation. And even just to create those experiences together certainly will connect us more deeply. If you can do things with your hands that make them dirty and disable you from reaching from your phone, or at least hinder you from doing that, I would highly encourage that behavior. Lauren, I just want to thank you so much again for your time for this conversation. I'm certainly going to be chewing on a lot of the stuff that we talked about for a long time. Like I mentioned earlier, we'll be linking where you can find more out about Lauren, Creative Exchange Studio, certainly Pottery for Generations, and any updates about whether there's new sessions of Pottery for Generations. Hopefully by the time this is out, we'll know that information. But thank you again so much, Lauren, for your time. And I can't wait to see what's next for you in the pottery world.
Thank you so much for your time and ideas and collaborating as well.